high-level discussion about the implementation and evaluation of the impact of public policies. This seminar results from the academic exchange between the French Research Institute for Sustainable Development and our university, materialized by the stay of François Roubaud and Michel Hazafin-Drancoto as visiting scholars. Moreover, it shows that this cooperation has already brought a lot of fruits beyond their research and teaching activities in our institute. The organization was a joint initiative with the Center for Studies on Inequality and Development research group, and we thank particularly Professor Valéria for leading it. We want to welcome all the participants of the seminar, in particular Sir Angus Deaton, Florent Bendecarra, Isabelle Guérin. I also thank the participation of our colleagues from Brazil, Ana Hermeto, Fábio Waltenberg, Lauro Gonzalez, and Ariana Brito. I hope the discussion will be fruitful and that it will contribute to the reflection on the design of public policies. So to not take up too much of the precious discussion time, I hand the floor over to Valéria.
Thank you, Fábio. And let me take this opportunity to welcome everyone who is participating in this conference on the debate on impact evaluation. The motivation is the launch in Brazil of the book Randomized Control Trials in the Field of Development, a Critical Perspective. The book raises important issues of the experimental approach to infer causal relations and estimate the impact of measures, interventions, and policies on poverty and other socioeconomic indicators. What is the exact scope of randomized control trials, RCTs in short? Which sorts of questions are RCTs able to address and which they do fail to answer? To what extent this methodology contributes to questions on development and welfare? The book addresses these relevant questions, explaining how RCTs work, what they can achieve, why they sometimes fail, how they can be improved, and why other methods are both useful and necessary. Moreover, there are critical questions related to external validity. This conference will present the volume, its main conclusions, with a special focus on the microcredit sector. Again, I'm very pleased to welcome, on behalf of the Economics Institute of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and the Center for Studies on Inequality and Development, to this first panel of the conference. This panel presents the controversies on epistemological, political, ethical, and scientific arguments behind the debate on RCTs in the field of development. The idea is to promote a dialogue between different standpoints on the whole of potential of RCTs on the impact evaluation of public policies. Let me briefly introduce the panelists and the dynamics of the panel. François Roubaud is economist, Senior Research Fellow of the French National Research Institute for Sustainable Development and visiting scholar at the Economics Institute of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Isabelle Guérin is a socioeconomist, Senior Research Fellow of the French National Research Institute for Sustainable Development, IRD. Both are co-editors of the book and will present the main ideas for the controversial perspective of RCTs and the main conclusions of the book. It's an honor to introduce Sir Angus Deaton, senior scholar and professor emeritus at Princeton University and presidential professor of economics at USC. He is author of the book, and he will present his contributions to this debate on development. After the presentations, Professor Ana Hermeto of the Center for Development and Regional Planning of the Federal University of Minas Gerais will comment. Finally, we will open the debate, including questions from the audience. So, if you have any question, please write on the live chat that runs on the side of the YouTube transmission, and we will try to respond as well as we can. François, it's over to you.
Thank you, Valéria. Boa tarde a todos. Prazer estar com vocês. Vou falar em inglês, essa sessão é em inglês, a próxima vai ser em português, mas obrigado pelo convite, and thanks for the invitation. I turn into English, and I'm very happy to be with you now to present and launch the book and also the debate on RCTs in development, and maybe with a focus on Brazil. Just to let you know that now, exactly at the same time, GEPAL, the main institution in RCTs, is organizing a conference in Brazil to sell the product, to sell the RCT in the country. And so you've got the presentation of the RCT on the one hand, and on the other line, our lines, the critiques on RCTs. So, to launch this book, and our presentation will be with two voices. I will begin with the making of the book, and then Isabelle will present our main takeaways. We usually presented this book with some background questions, so you can have that in your mind and think what you would have answered to such a poll. With the first question, do you think that RCT are generally the best tool to measure the impact of development intervention? The first question. The second question, according to you, how much of what works and what doesn't in development can be evaluated by RCTs? And third, with the massive increase of poverty due to COVID in the world, do you think that RCT make the difference in curbing the impact? So we will keep in mind that all we will present is aligned with the question raised by the pandemic and the massive shock on poverty due to the pandemic. So first, to make a bit of history of a nearly 10-year long research program, our motivations, it was just through this chart to see that there was sort of an exponential rise of what is called in development, in evaluation, the gold standard in impact evaluation, and also linked to this sort of an eviction effect over other methods, this one being experimental and the other one being quasi experimental or observational. And so it was a surprise for us and intriguing question, and we were wondering if it was a true revolution or just a fashion. So what were our initial research questions? We have two main research questions on the what. What are the methodological property of RCTs? Are they really great for us in the development? And the second is why. What was the road to the global success and what we could call the stairway to heaven? The core theme of our research program is Florent. He will present the RCT on microfinance later on in the second session. Isabelle, who is socioeconomist, more prone to qualitative approach and from the academia, while Florent was more from the donor side, and myself, economist and statistician, more dedicated at quantitative approaches and also from the academia. And after this first phase, up to 2017, we had the first set of results and paper assessing RCTs in development and the Randomista movement, the pro-RCT movement. Maybe one point here, what we call RCTs are RCTs in development, and we differentiate that from clinical trial in the field of medicine. What do we do in this first phase? First, we just conduct theoretical critiques, RCTs in theory, internal and external validity. And here we are one among many others and famous ones, in particular Professor Deaton, who began to work on this more than 10 years ago. Second, more original and empirical critiques, RCTs in practice, how experiments are conducted in the field, not only the theoretical properties, but also the real fabric of RCT. And finally, some reflection about the political economy of what we call the scientific business. I mentioned JPAL, but there are very key institutions in this business of RCT, globally the pro-RCT movement and the people behind we called the randomistas. So doing the math, which has been done by others, we had our stone, doing the cooking and doing the accounts, and in terms of accounts, financial and symbolic. What were our main set of conclusion? We had three types of conclusion. The first one may be obvious, and we concur, we agree with the idea that RCT is a sound tool to assess the causal impact of a project. But first, limited to a yes-no answer, and how much, quantifying the effect, but nothing on the why. So what are the channels through which the impact exists is not part of the RCT business. And second restriction is, okay, RCT is a sound tool, provided that they are conducted by the book and under certain conditions, with a big, huge problem that these conditions are so tight that they are rarely met in the real world. So that's the first conclusion. Second one, 3 of the randomistas' claims are illegitimate. First, they claim that RCT is the only rigorous or even scientific method in town. Second, RCT can explain all what works and what doesn't in development. And third, multi on all topics and all tropics will overcome external validity challenges, what we call the hegemonical project. And a third set of conclusion is about this political economy approach and trying to elaborate on a market domination strategy, how the monopoly or oligopoly and the rent capture have been achieved as a successful business, scientific business model in the academia, but also with the donors and some part of the public audience, at least in the North, and which raised the question of what we call the randomista hubris. Then, after this first set of paper, we follow up with a second phase in two parallel tracks up to now. The first one, to put the feet in the field, deeper in the field, through a thorough investigation of RCTs on microcredit. I won't elaborate on it now because Florent will present our work in the second session. And that's the object of this first session, a collective book, Randomized Controlled Trials in Development, a Critical Perspective, which had been published last year by Oxford University Press. And we are happy and pleased to let you know that we have reached open access rights, and we are now currently publishing a French translation. Unfortunately, nothing in perspective in Portuguese. So, to end up with this very brief presentation on the long way to the book, here you've got the outline of the book with 12 chapters and more, with a preface of Professor Deaton, who is going to present some of his insights and maybe other things next to us. Our general introduction of the editors, controversies around RCTs in development, addressing epistemological, ethical, and political issues. And Isabelle is going to present them just after me. And then we've got 4 blocks within this book. The first one, which is a broad overview of how can be assessed RCTs in development. And here you see famous names like Martin Ravallion or Len Pritchett or Jonathan Murdoch. The 2 first are quite critical, while the 2 second are more favorable to RCT under conditions. So the idea is to try to have a bit of controversy and discussion about the pros and cons of RCTs. The second block is about sectoral approach. After a broad view, let's investigate some specific sectors. And in the book, we investigate in depth 3 different sectors. The first one is global health. The second one is on sanitation, WASH sector. And finally, the last one is on microfinance. And again, Florent is going to present them. The third block of the book is about the political economy approach of all the story about RCTs and randomistas. The first one is a thorough, in-depth analysis of the poor economics by Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, trying to see how this is linked to RCTs and the art of persuasion. And the second one is from Robert Picciotto, who is a professional, he's part of the evaluation community, which is a bit different from the academic community with intersection, and trying to see if randomistas fulfill the properties of this community of evaluators of projects and policies. The fourth part is about, we've got RCTs, we mentioned shortcomings. What could be some proposals to improve the current state of the art in this direction, with discussion on ethics in RCTs and specific principle, which is famous in the epidemiological field, like equipoise, and then more technical contribution with the idea to use priors in experimental design to improve RCTs. Finally, we've got an epilogue by James Ekman. James Ekman wrote a paper in the beginning of the 90s about the first waves of RCTs mainly in the US, to evaluate social policies. And now he revisits in the book his paper with the corresponding recommendation in the light of the second wave of RCTs in development. And finally, we've got a postface with some interviews of policymakers. We were in the academia previously, but now let's go to the policy side. Real policymaker in the real world. In France, with two contributions of the CIO of our respective institution, from the research side and from the donor side in France, and also interviews of two high-ranking officers of the Indian government who on a daily basis implement, follow, evaluate policy, and try to see how in India, which is one of the two main fields of RCTs in the world, with Kenya in Africa, or in Asia, it's India, and how these RCT contributed to the real policies in this country. So with this, I end with my general presentation and give the floor to Isabelle for the insights on our takeaway. Thank you a lot. Muito obrigado a todos.
Can you see my screen?
Could you focus on Isabelle now, Valéria?
Isabelle?
She's coming.
Okay, can you see my presentation? It's not there, no?
Not yet.
It's coming. Okay. Okay, I can start while it's coming, no? So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. And first of all, let me thank the organizers, UFRJ and Valéria Reto in particular, for this great opportunity. Well, I'm not going to summarize the book. As François was saying, I'm just going to highlight a few points, and in particular, one of the key findings that we get from this dialogue between different disciplines, between scholars and policymakers, and also a dialogue between different visions regarding the scope of RCTs. I think my screen is not there yet. Shall I?
Valéria, não está compartilhado a tela.
You have, Isabelle, you have to click on your presentation. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. Okay, so, and then, sorry, I have to move it. Yes. And for the key question behind this book, François said it already, but I'm going to repeat it to make sure it's clear. The key question for us is what divides, on the one hand, the advocates of RCTs, and on the other side, its critics. And to put it differently, what are the areas of disagreement? Or again, to put it in another way, what are the terms of the debate? And here there are 3 points which clearly come out from this discussion and from this dialogue: epistemology, politics, and ethics, which are, of course, very much articulated. And by putting all this together, it helps us to really define the scope of application of RCTs, and what are the questions they can answer, and what are the questions they cannot answer. So let me start with the very first issue, which has to do with epistemology. With here, I would say a certain form of positivism, or even sometimes scientism, against what could be called pragmatism. The question is, are we looking for universal answers, Or are we looking for reasonable explanations, limited in time and space, and attentive to the diversity of situations, including within specific groups? As some of you probably know already, the claim of randomistas to universality has already been strongly criticized, and because of their inability in a number of cases to demonstrate what is called external validity, what is true in a specific context might not apply elsewhere. For instance, the results observed in the Indian village cannot be easily transposed to a Brazilian village or even to a Bolivian city. And the result of one particular RCT can hardly be generalized elsewhere. This has been demonstrated already. Another key aspect which has already been criticized and discussed is the limits of the average result. RCT focus on the average result, while in many cases, what matters for practitioners and for policymakers is precisely the heterogeneity of the result, who gains and who loses from a particular intervention. Well, this has been discussed already. There is nothing new in this, but it's always useful to repeat it. Something which has been less discussed is, and François talked about it, but I'm going to enter into the details, is the gap between the protocol in theory and the protocol in practice. And here the question is, should we focus primarily on a theoretical, on a pure protocol able of measuring causality and statistical inference? Or are we concerned about the feasibility of the protocol, the way it is implemented in practice, in the ground, in the real world? Well, here, randomization might work well in theory. The thing is that in practice, given the multiple challenges faced by the implementation in the ground, in the real world, in a number of cases, this is not the case. And in many cases, field constraints contradict the assumption of the statistical theorems used for statistical inference. And here, what we see and what come out from the book is the fact that deviations between protocol and implementation can be observed all the way down the knowledge production line, starting with sampling, with here, in a number of cases, multiple biases between treatment and control group for practical reasons, for ethical reasons, while it is precisely supposed to be the strength. Another problem has to do with insufficient take-up and consequently insufficient difference in exposure to the intervention, which in turn weakens the ability to draw conclusions due to lack of statistical power. A problem that would require unrealistic sample sizes and therefore unrealistic budgets to be solved. Another problem which is connected relates to the fact that in some cases, the intervention is artificially transformed to meet the requirements of the protocol. For instance, to increase the take-up in the field of microcredit, large advertising campaigns, a lowering of the prices, fewer collaterals, and in the field of insurance, again, large advertising campaigns, bonuses for the staff. Well, why not? But the thing is, the program under consideration becomes a very specific program. Well, another problem has to do with data collection. I won't have time to elaborate on this, but I guess Florent will come back to this in his own presentation. And last and not least, at the end of the chain, interpretation of the results. In theory, the result is a simple comparison of averages. In practice, the interpretation of the results involves a number of assumptions and hypotheses, and even in some cases, an art of rhetoric that proves to be extremely persuasive. This is a topic of the labels chapter. And all these have critical implications for the type of intervention RCT can study and the type of question they can answer. With the fact that this disproportionate importance placed on the theoretical purity of the protocol and demonstration of causality at the expense of protocol feasibility. This brings us to the political question, to the second aspect. And here, the question is, what do we mean by development? In short, Do we consider development and the fight against poverty as an aggregation of private goods, micro-interventions, or do we consider development first and foremost as a matter of transformative politics, infrastructure, institutions? And here, regardless of the worldview of randomistas, the technical constraints of RCT protocol force them to focus on micro-interventions and private goods. A few examples in the global field of poverty as a whole. Do we look at microcredit, or do we look at national, regional, or sectoral wealth creation processes? If we move to the field of global health, do we look at mosquito nets, water filters, medical advice by text message, or do we look at complex and systemic health system, which in turn requires a complex infrastructure, a national healthcare policy, trained and qualitative staff, and so forth? In the field of sanitation, is the key question what the interest rate should be to encourage the poor to borrow and build toilets? Or is the key question rather how to build a complete infrastructure able to manage human waste management? And the last example that we have in the field of governance and public administration, do we look at random inspections, surveillance camera in classrooms, or do we look at weak state capacity, centralized bureaucracy, scarce resources, a challenging work environment? So for each sector, you can see that there is a real opposition of vision between what is the development and the fight against poverty of the randomistas on the one hand, made of aggregation of micro-interventions and mainly of individual and private goods. And on the other hand, a transformative vision involving national and international policies, the setting up of infrastructure, and institutional and political change. Another key aspect, which also come up from the book, is still in this regarding the meaning of development. For the reasons mentioned earlier, deviations between official protocol and real protocol. For these reasons, in a number of cases, the ability of RCT to measure impact is in fact rather limited. And quite often, RCTs are rather used to compare different modalities of a specific intervention. For instance, agriculture fertilizer combined with training or without training, a sanitation loan combined with awareness session or without awareness session, or microcredits with various sorts of interest rate and so forth. And then the RCT measure not the impact, but rather the take-up. Do people borrow more microcredit when it is cheaper or when it is associated with financial education, etc.? And this is a crucial lesson. In many cases, RCTs are in fact better adapted to test behaviors rather than evaluating impact. And if we change prices, time frames, if we provide information, training, how do people behave? And how does this affect the take-up, whether they use the intervention or not? Well, you can look at this in two ways. One is to consider that this allows for a better understanding of the behaviors. This is a point by Jonathan Murdoch, given that in some cases, all the results challenge a number of misconceptions in development economics. One of the examples given by Murdoch is in the field of microcredit, and the fact that RCTs have shown that, contrary to a widespread belief, the poor are sensitive to prices. We can also look at this in another way and consider that ultimately those kind of RCTs are similar to what we could call social marketing. By this, I mean how to better distribute or sell a product, a microcredit, a water filter, a toilet, or whatever, which we believe has a positive social impact. But in fact, in many cases, we still don't know. So, well, if you consider development as an aggregation of micro-interventions, this is fine, but remember that the impact issue remains unanswered. It is much more problematic if you consider development as transformative politics. So let me go to the last point, ethics. And I'm pretty sure that Professor Deaton will get back to this. Of course, any kind of research entails ethical issues. The thing is that RCTs are much more concerned than observational studies, since they manipulate the environment they study. So here, as many of you probably know, a number of ethical standards do exist and have been designed by various declarations and reports, informed consent, do not harm principle, and et cetera, et cetera. And what is very striking is that in a number of cases, randomistas ignore those standards. How can we explain this? Here in the book, we have a specific chapter by Abramowitz and Safans, economists and in the field of economics and medicine. And other authors, including Professor Deaton, also deal with this ethical issue. And the answer is quite simple. If I had to summarize it a bit quickly, I would say that there is a trade-off between ensuring the internal validity of the protocol on the one hand, and on the other hand, guaranteeing the protection of the experiments subject. And quite often, the first prevails over the second. And so the key question here is, do we advance science or do we protect the people? As a way of conclusion, two things. One is why it is so important to clearly define the scope of RCT. It is crucial because this method tend to have a massive crowding out effect. Crowding out effect in terms of methods. François showed you this nice graph. Crowding out effect in terms of human resources. Crowding out effects in terms of intervention. This is particularly the case in the field of global health, as one of the chapters show, the fact that a number of health interventions are now designed in such a way that they can be evaluated by RCTs, which is obviously quite dramatic, since it means focusing on micro-interventions and not designing national health systems. And the very last point, RCT and the pandemic. Here, the response of randomistas to the current pandemic seem to largely confirm our observations. What are they saying about the pandemic and the pandemic crisis? First, they use the previous work to encourage the use of nudges in a number of domains, for instance, to increase insurance take-up, to improve online schooling, to improve social distancing behavior. They also advise governments to make major investments in cash transfers and mobile money infrastructure. Well, I'm not saying this is useless, and let me insist that the book is not at all intended to reject the use of RCTs altogether, but to better define the scope of application. So all those things are not useless, but what is really innovative, this is not very clear. Evidence is in a number of cases doubtful, as I was saying earlier. And thirdly, the focus remains on individual interventions when there has never been a greater need for structural responses. And what about the reconstruction of value chains? What about the tax system and fiscal and monetary policy that can finance those transfer policies? What about health policies? All those crucial questions are missing. Well, thank you. I stop here.
Thank you, Isabelle. And Professor Angus Deaton, please.
Unmute. I think I'm already sharing my screen. Can you see it? Okay, I'm all right to go. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm always happy to talk about randomized controlled trials, and it was a pleasure to contribute to this book. And I'm always thinking about these things. My views are changing all the time. And so I'll add some of those today. I don't seem to be able to move this forward. I'm stuck. So here's an outline of what I will say. There are many misunderstandings about what RCTs can and cannot do. I have a much longer, too long paper in Social Science and Medicine with the philosopher Nancy Cartwright. I'm going to revisit a few of these points, and perhaps this will make a few people uncomfortable, but that's okay. A lot of what we're doing, I think, is trying to make people think that these things are not as simple, not as straightforward as they're often thought to be. I'm going to talk a little bit about causality. I'm much more skeptical than François that RCTs can tell us much about causality. They can certainly tell us something. I'll talk a little bit about whether RCTs can be effective in the reduction of poverty or of inequality, which is always a deep concern in Brazil. And are they good at finding out what works? Say something about ethics of RCT in development, on which, in my view, there's been too little discussion. It seems to me I have to go back to my screen. So just to clarify, François categorized me as someone who's fairly opposed, but I'm certainly not against doing randomized controlled trials. For example, I'm very glad that the vaccines were tested in this way. In development, RCTs yield a data point, an average treatment effect, and some kind of standard error. And in fact, that's knowledge. All knowledge is welcome. The trouble is, if we start to expect too much of them, they're not magic, nor do they yield the truth. And it's very good to know what they can and cannot do. So there's a whole question about why we're writing this book and why it's necessary even to think about methods. And it's a very important point to make that methods should never dominate over substance. Let me say that again. We should never be guided by method over what we're trying to find out, which is the substance. It's very odd that we don't, well, it seems to me very strange that JPAL only does randomized controlled trials. I don't understand why they do it. Well, I do understand it because they've been very successful in doing it and it's attracted a lot of money. But that's not a scientific reason why they only do this. They should be trying to understand and eliminate poverty. And without understanding of the mechanisms, policy is really unlikely to work. So tying your hands is always a bad idea. I mean, if you say, look, I'm going to try and investigate poverty, but I'm only going to do it with RCTs, then you rule out all sorts of other things that might actually be a very good idea. It's clear that, if a study involves an RCT, that by itself is no guarantee that it's a good study. And that's really, really very important thing to realize. Any study has to help us learn something for what is relevant in the problem at hand. And you're going to have to weigh up evidence from RCTs against evidence from other things, and we can't give any sort of priority that it's automatically right because it came from an RCT. The other thing that's true is that you don't get a free get out of jail card because you did an RCT. All of the statistical and econometric problems that we've always wrestled with in doing econometrics more generally are present in RCTs. Something that I learned a lot from was I was at a conference in Europe, and a young researcher was talking about a very interesting paper about a particular treatment in a country in Africa. And this treatment had been applied in some provinces of the country, but not others. This was a country that didn't have very many provinces, maybe 10 or 12. And the author said in the weaknesses section of the paper, now that we've all become like medical journals, you have to have a piece in your paper saying what's wrong with it. And in the weaknesses section, the author said that the study would have been better if the provinces had been randomly selected. And I suddenly thought that that was just really a very, very weird thing to say, because the provinces that were in the paper could have well have been randomly selected. Or indeed, if they had been randomly selected and they'd been a little bit different, would that have made it okay? So you can imagine data that were randomly selected and data that were not randomly selected, and they're identical, and one is a good study and it's supposed to be causal, and the other one is not, and is therefore better. So it's absurd to think that just because random selection somehow makes things better. So what does it do? Well, the story that we're often told is that randomization constructs two otherwise identical groups. And therefore, the only difference between the two groups is the treatment. And that means that you can see the causal effect of the student. Well, that's wrong. And it's just a terrible misunderstanding. Because randomization does not construct two otherwise identical groups. Just imagine having a group of people for you, for instance, at a conference in front of you, and you select one person at random, and then you select another person at random. Does the randomization make those identical? Well, of course not. What you really want, of course, is the average to be identical, which will be better with large samples, but it depends how many causes are operating and need to be balanced. So let's say you've got a treatment in which its effectiveness depends on 10, 20, or 30 factors, and maybe their interactions. Then your sample had better be balanced across those 20 or 30 factors and all the possible interactions before it creates the preconditions that only the treatment is having any effect. What randomization does give us, and this is something that Fisher understood from the very beginning, what it does give us is a method of quantifying the probability that the result could have come about by chance, or at least if you're lucky and you do your inference correctly, your statistical inference correctly. So that it doesn't balance the two groups, but it helps you control, because they're randomly selected, how much difference there can be. Now, there are all sorts of technical issues, which I don't want to get into, but I didn't know this when I started. And it's become clear to me as I got older and learned more about these things, that this inference can be fragile. And actually, one of the things that the randomistas sell to policymakers is that it's a very simple matter, because you have two groups, one treated and one untreated. All you have to do is subtract the two means. And what could be simpler? Well, it turns out that there are very, very deep statistical problems associated with the comparison of two means. And in particular, the calculation can get very wrong if there are outliers in one of the groups or other. So that I say here, depending on skewness. And often, in fact, if you think of the treatment, that's something to do with microfinance, for instance, it's quite possible that that could have a very large effect on a relatively small number of people. And those outliers will dominate the result of the experiment. And you think you've got thousands of observations, but in fact, you only have one or two. So what has to happen is that you have to make a whole bunch of assumptions in order to find out whether the result of your experiment came about by chance or it came about for real, because something was actually going on. So that requires assumptions, and RCTs are less non-parametric than they sometimes seem. They really appeal to people because you don't have to build a model. And the older I get, the more I realize that not having to build a model is a bad thing. It's not a good thing. A lot of people are pushing for Fisher's randomization inference, which is a method of getting good standard errors. The trouble with that is it only works if your hypothesis is that everybody has exactly the same treatment effect. Often that's not what you want to know. You want to know in some social policy whether the average improves, not whether everybody improves. And so we don't really have a good method for checking that. That means that lots of RCT results are wrong. Alan Young has done good work on this. If you rework those experiments, it turns out that the conclusions don't actually hold because of these statistical problems. Some people claim that they like experiments because they often give them very surprising results. Well, I would claim a lot of those surprising results are surprising because they're not true. Let me talk a little bit about causality. So it's often believed that an RCT can establish causality. It certainly tells you something about causality, but it's not true that an RCT can establish causality. The way that Jim Heckman likes to put it is that causality is in the mind, not in the data. Causality is not something you can discover from looking at data. Causality is, if you like, an attitude, a theory, a way of thinking about the world. So why, when you get an RCT and it shows an effect, is that not causal? Well, let me give you just a few examples. There's always the possibility that the result was by chance. And so, that doesn't, if the result was by chance and the true average treatment effect is 0, then, that's always possible. There's always some untestable assumption on which the result depends. So, for instance, I think of this as non-blinding, for instance. If the two groups are different, if some people know they're getting the treatment and other people know they're not getting the treatment, then the differences between the groups could have something to do with something that's nothing to do with the treatment. So that's a really important. Even when they're blinded, there can often be clue to which status, which group you're in, and that will cause problems. One of the examples I like is you can do a theoretical model in which the average effect is positive and significant when you do measure the outcomes in levels, but not in logs. So for instance, if you say, how much did this experiment increase the average income of people, you can say, wow, we got a big effect. But then what was the percentage that increased people's income? You can find there's no effect at all. So it's just absurd in that case to claim that it's in levels it's causal and in logs it's not causal. Causal has nothing to do with how you measure the data. So there's a very nice quote by the philosophers Broadbent and the epidemiologist Van den Broek, that causal conclusions do not follow deductively from data without a strong set of auxiliary assumptions. And these assumptions are themselves not deductive consequences of the data. You cannot get causality out of data in any shape or form. It comes out of a whole web of knowledge. A little more on causality. The totality of evidence that leads to the verdict of causality. It's a scientific conclusion, a theoretical claim, and as such transcends any individual study. What is causal in one place may not be causal somewhere else. So it can be a local causality that's not necessarily transportable or generalizable. My co-author Nancy Cartwright likes to give the example of a lever, or what in America we call a lever. It works the same in general. And in fact, you use a lever when you toast bread in a toaster. You use a lever when you flush a toilet. But you can't toast bread by flushing a toilet, and you can't, well, I won't go any further that way. But causality often depends on multiple factors being present, it's conditional. So let me take a very famous study, the deworming study in Kenya. So deworming pills help some children. Let's say that evidence is true. But it's certainly, Nancy Cartwright likes to say, well, now I know why my granddaughter is not doing very well in school. It's because we forgot to give her deworming pills. And, that's, her granddaughter lives in Oxford, and no one is recommending giving deworming pills to children in Oxford, in England. So you say, well, that's silly because there are no worms in Oxford. Okay, that's the easy bit. But what about in places where there are worms, but there's good sanitation, so that the worms don't get transmitted from one to a kid, or as one kid to another? Or what happened in the American South, where children wearing shoes made a huge difference, and they could fight worms not with pills, but with shoes. All of these factors are causal in some sense, in that you need all of these operating for the cause to work. So cause is not just one simple arrow from one thing to another. It's in a sort of assembly of things that make it a mechanism which will give you the result that you want. And these are mechanisms that we need to understand to set policy. Again, let me give you an example I've been thinking about recently, and Isabelle said this too, that RCTs are silent on mechanisms. So you get an average treatment effect, but will not tell you how that treatment effect came about, or whether it's local or has wider implications, or what those implications might be. We had an election in the United States this week. And an election is like a randomized controlled trial. It gives you an average effect. One side wins or the other side doesn't win. Republicans in these elections did better than expected. So we have the result, but it doesn't tell us why. And I've been reading the newspapers the last couple of days, and some commentators say it was race was the big issue. Some say it was education. Some say it was the pandemic. Others, the economy. The others, the failure of the Biden administration in Afghanistan, or the failure of the administration to deliver on its agenda. And that's just the start. Now, all of those could be true. Some of them could be true. Others could be false. But we can't tell from the poll result itself. And that's exactly the same with an RCT. We get this average effect, but you don't know why it came about. Or to put it another way, we need supplementary evidence. Exit polls can really help, or comparisons across different places where some of these factors work and others of them don't. And the same is true for RCTs. So I like to use the word transportability rather than external validity. The problem is that if you say external validity, it sort of sounds like internal validity, but a little bit different. Internal validity is a property of an actual trial. It tells you whether it was done right or not. External validity has nothing to do with that trial. It's whether these results of those trials could go something else. And if a trial fails to be externally valid, that does not mean it's wrong or it's not useful. All it's telling you is that it doesn't work somewhere else, that there are no worms in Oxford. And that doesn't mean that the trial in Kenya was wrong. So here's an important example of transportability, this program that JPAL has been pushing that gives people assets and monitoring and assistance, and it reduces poverty in a trial run by JPAL or another organization. And it seems to do so in many countries around the world. Now, the crucial question, if you want to reduce poverty or inequality in another country, is will it work when run by a government agency? Because JPAL can't run all these programs, nor should they. They should be run by local people. So it depends on the behavior of the agents who are going to do this. I mean, the local people, the doctors, the nurses, the agricultural extension workers, like with school teachers or nurses. And what these people do depends on incentives and motivation, which are the topics of economic analysis. So just to give a counterexample, we already know that schools and clinics work under some conditions, but there are huge practical problems in delivery in every country in the world. Maybe we need to focus on those, not on finding some new program that works. There are lots of programs that we know can work under some conditions. And that's not always the problem. Let me say a little about inequality. RCTs are often seen as finding out what works in poverty reduction, and then you can scale up, and that would reduce poverty and presumably inequality. But if you look at, there's been huge numbers of poverty experiments done in the US by what is now called MDRC. It used to be called the Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation, and now just called MDRC, and they've done a lot of experiments for the US government. And if you read the literature on those, they're not so much about improving the well-being of the poor. What politicians really want those experiments to find out is to find the cheapest way of supporting poor at some socially minimal level, which is what the politicians ask them. The targets are usually the costs, not the welfare of those being treated. Now that actually matters because they're not actually, the object is not to improve the welfare of the poor. The object is to save rich people money who are paying for this. So it becomes therefore a technocratic fix of what is essentially a political problem. Now, my reading of history is that inequality is historically reduced by political action from below. It's not done by technical solutions from above. That doesn't deny that programs can sometimes be helpful, but if you're serious about reducing inequality, you have to talk about political action, not technocratic action by technocratic elites. It doesn't work. So let me, I think this is the last topic is about ethical issues, institutional review boards. Many people will say, well, this passed the institutional review board and we're okay. That's a terrible thing to say. We have to have institutional review boards, which will knock out some of the worst and grossest things. But the composition and decision-making of IRBs is not uniform. It would be really good if we knew why IRBs do what they do by publishing the deliberation, but they're often not independent of investigators. So once again, we have power and inequality issues, this time working through the IRBs being in the hands of wealthy researchers. There are many difficult places in the world, and this is becoming an increasingly problem. I mean, weak or corrupt governments in many countries extends to review procedures. So not all their governments and their actions act in the best interests of their people. Indeed, that's surely one of the central problems of development. I mean, if you think of Acemoglu and Johnson and so on, where governments are actually not acting in the interests of their people, but are acting in a way to exploit them. Can you or should you run experiments in Russia, and North Korea, and Burundi, Syria, Venezuela, just to give you a list of places? So researchers need to accept ethical responsibility for their experiments, and the outcome of those experiments depends on the governance structure of the country in which they're working. In particular, the beneficence requirement of trials is not satisfied by thinking you know what is good for others. This has been a real problem with the infusion of behavioral economics into RCTs, that we don't have any framework anymore for adjudicating what's good for other people, and we get to sort of decide. And that's especially true of people who are not your fellow citizens and have no recourse or claim on you, though perhaps there's a partial exemption for vaccines or for other medicines. So there's the question of who is experimenting on whom. And the thing that's always worried me about this literature, is it really okay that experiments are better educated, experimenters are better educated, better healed, and paler in color than the people who are being experimented upon? Within a country, the US or other countries, there's democratic control and feedback. So, Hal Varian says, well, Google's doing experiments on you all the time, and that's okay. But Google is perhaps at least democratically accountable in that we can call Hal Varian in front of Congress and tell them that they can't do certain things. But what about in other countries? The poor in India or in Chad have no recourse against the World Bank or against university researchers in rich countries doing experiments in poor countries. There's been recent questioning of number of experiments in India and Kenya. The Indian one was an experiment and undermined solidarity and likely broke the law, asked people to cheat on their fellow workers and left them to deal with it. There were experimental disconnection of water supply in Nairobi. There are experiments that affect the outcome of elections, so you're interfering with someone else's democracy. And IRBs within a country typically restrict experiments on prisoners' children because they have limited autonomy. So here we have again a situation where power and inequality are involved, and the people at the top are experimenting on the people on the bottom, and I think that's typically not acceptable. Ignoring politics is a vice, not a virtue, as many seem to think. Many people think that RCTs are a technocratic tool which bypasses, it doesn't really get involved in politics. Bill Easterby likes to call this the technocratic illusion. And it's been the besetting sin of external economic development from the beginning. Famous book by Charles Ferguson, The Anti-Politics Machine. And, people say, they're fond of saying nowadays that when we do these experiments, we're doing them in partnership with the country. But partnerships means nothing when all the money is on one side, which is typically the case. There's no such thing as finding out what works, unconditional of the environment and of local politics. And people talk about the experiments being rigorous, whatever that means. It usually means that they're ignoring politics. My friend and co-author Jean Drez in India, he gives a wonderful example of eggs, which is hypothetical but realistic. You can imagine RCT finds that putting eggs into school meals in India promotes both nourishment and learning. So you get a really good RCT. We think that eggs really benefit these kids. But then you put that into place as a policy. There are lots of groups in India that oppose eggs incredibly fiercely. I remember an Indian friend of mine coming to the United States, and her daughter went to school in Washington, D.C. And at Easter time, she came home with a chocolate egg, and her mother was outraged. Eggs were absolutely evil, and even chocolate ones were evil and shouldn't have been things. So you get lobbyists for the poultry interests who like eggs, or people who manufacture dried eggs, or some manufactured substitution. And so you get all these people coming in on this, which has nothing to do with the RCT, or it has to do with the RCT, but it's going to modify the conclusion. And the policy is going to require politicians and coalitions between them, not just evidence. Evidence is sort of part of it. We would like to make policy based on evidence, but policy cannot only be made from evidence. And as we know, people who argue about these things will cherry pick results from RCTs all the time. I think this is my last slide. I love this quote by Dean Spears, which was, he's one of the authors in the book, though I think this was a private communication. He said, RCTs provide a ready and high status language that allows mutual legitimization among funders, researchers, and governments. Notice that it does not involve the people who are being experimented on. Even in situations where arguing for a policy that's only arguably supported by the RCT evidence, and so they get used in an oppressive and anti-democratic way, that science or evidence is used to hit people over the head and make them do things that they don't want to do, which we've certainly seen during the pandemic. Funders love this too. They're very attached to rigor. I remember being in a debate with a scientific officer of a big foundation, and he said these are the only rigorous ways of finding out. And I said, well, what do you understand by rigor? And he had absolutely no idea at all. He just picked up the word and the rhetoric, and people love this word. So the rigor legitimizes these inequalities between the experimenters on the one hand and the people who are being experimented on. So again, nothing here applies to all uses in all cases. RCTs often introduce variation that's not otherwise possible. But it's very important to note that experimentation doesn't necessarily require randomization. I've heard people during the pandemic say this was not an experiment because there was no randomization. Well, you know, kicking a rock with your foot to see whether it hurts or not is certainly an experimental situation. And we can often do experiments in which different parts of the country try out different things. And then we can correct often for the effects of selection or something that we've been doing in economics for a really long time. And in fact, the role of randomization is not frequently enough discussed, given other ways of purposely selecting and actually getting better estimates. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Professor Angus Deaton. Let me introduce now Professor Ana Hermeto for the comments, please. Ana Hermeto.
I'm the wrong person, no?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Valéria. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone here from Belo Horizonte. I'd like to thank you a lot for the invitation, and it's such a pleasure to be here to comment the book. And first of all, I want to congratulate the organization of this event and the book. It's a very well constructed book, and it's a really important call to controversy in science. And as I say, the objective is not to reconcile authors and find a compromise, but to give readers a picture of the issues involved in the debate. So again, it's a call for the importance of the controversy. And I think it's a lot commendable and necessary political economy of policy evaluation as a whole. And yeah, so I'd like first to recognize Professor Deaton as an inspiration and reference for our studies and for training of lots of generations of students and researchers here in Brazil. Again, it's important to mention that the launch of this book occurs in a specific historical moment in Brazil, in unfortunate coincidence that we are in a context of the reconfiguration or dismantling of recognized and well-succeeded CCT, the Bolsa Família program, assessed by many works in its several dimensions, diverse, intentional and non-intentional results. Overwhelmingly, most of them reveals positive results. And the evaluations conducted very well without the use of RCTs. And I think it's an example of the impossibility of RCTs for a program of this size, this magnitude and complexity of governance. And also, I have to mention that we are also in a context of setbacks in public funding to research, science, and knowledge in Brazil. And all these aspects are exacerbated throughout this long period of the pandemic that is also magnified in Brazil. So I'll not take long on my comments. I'll leave room for questions of the audience to have this pleasure to interact with the authors and just give a sort of a kickoff of questions, not as a dissonant voice or antagonic standpoint, but much more to echo the critical perspective to the methods from the viewpoint of someone that used in my research quasi experimental designs to evaluate training programs and also the Bolsa Família program since the end of the 90s. And we have also this intensive use of quantitative instrumental, but without previous randomization. And most recently, we are trying to apply these efforts to understand, like we say, those effects or those response effects, a kind of stratification, but also not experimental in this sense. I'd like to mention that the relevance of this book, and the book was much fueled by questions and by the Nobel Prize of the 2019. And I'd like to add is the Nobel Prize of this year, of 2021, and pose a questions. If 2019 was the year of the unintended, the intended experiment, the 2021 is the year of the unintended experiment. And I have to mention that Professor Imbans is a strong defense voice for RCTs. And although causality is at the core of both of these research and at the core of this line of economics, we can say that experimentation is kind of an elusive affair. Sometimes is that the world offers experiments with ready-made controls, but if only economists know where to look. But even in our messy, non-random world can offer data that let us make plausible inferences and cause and effect. Well, some points that I like to stress is like something that we say the absent voices of development economics from the global south. The rise of these RCTs to evaluate development policy is characterized by a wide range of ethical complexities, including key ethical challenges of the field research in the global south. And the use of RCTs to evaluate public policies and interventions in developing countries faces several challenges. These include limited budgets to finance sample designs and sample sizes required to evaluate multifaceted interventions, potential small sample bias arising from such limited samples, and difficulties in random assignment when participants self-exclude from parts of the intervention. In addition, institutional challenges arise when seeking to evaluate large-scale interventions implemented within a state bureaucracy as compared to NGO small pilot evaluations. So practical challenges facing RCTs when used as a public policy and program evaluation mechanism. We have to take into account these methodological and institutional challenges, and I want to know, what do you think about this? The promise of experimental approaches to help reduce poverty depends on the impact they have on policy and implementation. That makes it important to consider how institutional mechanisms and government structures translate these findings into policy or not. We should look at each stage of the policy cycle and discuss how experimental findings could change the evidence used in policymaking for poverty reduction. We should also discuss the role of experimental evidence in the design of a broader evaluation design. So one point that I like to come back is the point of the definitions and meanings of development. So development economics focus on improving the well-being of billions of people in low-income countries, but the global south is severely underrepresented in the field. The long-standing problem of underrepresentation is amplified by the growing use of RCTs to test the effectiveness of specific poverty reduction interventions. So, although the RCT movement deserves credit for highlighting the need for rigor in development economics, it has had exclusionary consequences. In 2020, RCTs accounted for about 40% of the articles in the leading journals, and exclusion characterized the RCT movement itself. I would mention the seminar that is taking place now concurrently to ours, but it has already been said. Indeed, the cost of carrying out RCTs can run into millions of dollars per paper, making it difficult for developing country researchers to study their own countries without referencing to wealthy institutions, academic orthodoxies. If these researchers cannot do RCT-based studies, they have little chance to get published in leading journals and risk being consigned to second-class status. So this crowding out, I think, is a point that I want to ask again and to come back to this. Also, this tension between what policymakers in lower income economies consider important and what academics deem worthy of publication in top journals. So another point in coming back to the meaning of development and why not the poverty in these COVID times. I think the COVID, and Isabelle has pointed it, and I want to ask further that if RCTs in these times of COVID, wouldn't bring this redesign, changes in time frames, and communication of results, and this speedy of changes would bring a kind of anachronism in concepts. Do you think that? And the very meaning of positive impact, the positive impact, if there is an impact of, in what extent is this impact, it can change also. And RCTs, how RCTs can deal with this. So the meaning of development and poverty and inequalities, I think inequalities we have to bring to the center of the stage also. And this concepts of poverties, vulnerabilities, and accumulation of disadvantages, that is multidimensionality, which is a strong point in the book for the multidisciplinarity of approaches. So I'm finishing. I think we also have the question of the combination of actions, policies, and programs at different public levels and conducted by civil society. And this makes the task of evaluation even more complex. And it's not possible to neglect such complexity. So one question is about how to deal with these multiple treatments. Here in Brazil, we have a lot of examples of multiple treatments, and how can we deal with this with RCTs. And finally, the question of scalability or scale. When we say this, we are talking about different countries in the world, but in Brazil we have this internal diversity, and we have the challenge of universal policies for the whole country and this extreme diversity. So how do you think this? We have to go to meta-analysis of results of how can we do this. And the COVID, this time of COVID-19 also reinforce the digital device that here is revealed much more forcefully by the pandemic. And this affects surveys, results, and research. So finally, I just want to say about financing of these evaluations and these politics of policy evaluation, especially in social sciences, and the allocation of scarce research for the programs and for the evaluation itself. And I think we have to resume to the idea of the discussion of efficiency and effectiveness for poverty reduction, but also to equity impacts. And the timing frame is results in short and long-term, intergenerational, multiple, individual, and local. How can we deal with this kind of experiments? I think this is so much important. So, well, I have taken some time to address the value or lack of value of RCTs. I'm not against them in principle, but I consider that they must be used with care and when necessary. And therefore, some of the claims being made need to be taken with caution or not taken at all. So this is my starting point, and I would come back later. Thank you, Valéria. And I'll be here to follow up the questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ana. Very interesting presentations and commentaries. And we have questions from the audience. And I think it's better to put all the questions, and then I will give the words for the presentations for the speakers to respond as well as possible the questions. So we start with the question of Victor. Do you think that the criticism applies to quasi-experimental designs as well? And then the question of Daniele. In your opinion, what are the best alternatives techniques to RCT? Do you have critics to other techniques using causal inference? So I put these two questions together. It can be answered. And then we have questions for Fabio. Isabelle and François, you say randomistas draw exaggerated conclusions, policy prescriptions from experiments flagged by deficiencies. But isn't that a bad practice affecting non-randomistas as well? And then another question for Professor Ochoa, Professor Angus, Deaton, and all. Isn't this overvaluation of RCTs a more general symptom of the overevaluation of or obsession with causality in applied economics? And finally, the question from Andrea. How do you see this new generation of development economics in comparison with the old questions? For instance, Richemont. We can follow the presentation started with François and then Isabelle, and finally, Angus, Deaton, please.
Okay, thank you, Valeria. I thought that Isabelle could have begun to change the order, but
okay, it's up to you.
Yeah. Isabelle, would you agree with this?
If you want. Thank you so much for Anna for the questions. I mean, you raised so many questions. I'm just going to pick a few of them. To start with, one is the central issue of scaling up. No? And here, let me make a side comment. A key question we didn't have the time to enter into this, but who is in demand for those RCTs? And in according to randomistas, national governments are increasingly in demand for RCTs, and they are claiming that they are building an increasing number of partnerships with governments. When you look at how it's going in practice, in fact, it is the case, and it is an argument that's put in the book, and which is quite clear in the chapter I preached this. And we also come back to this in the introduction. The organization which are most often in demand for RCTs are NGOs, big NGOs, private foundations, which, as we know, are increasingly playing a key role in the field of development, social policies. And we also know that this is a very competitive field, and it seems to me that RCTs are in fact mostly used to legitimize their intervention. And this reflects what I was saying earlier, the fact that success of RCT would certainly haven't been the same 20 years earlier. It comes from a number of factors. I don't have the time to elaborate. Maybe François will come back to the issue of the profile of those, this new generation of research entrepreneurs. I let François elaborate on this. I would just say that I've said this already, but I think it's important to emphasize this. The fact that it really reflects a specific view of development, which is an aggregation of micro-intervention at the expense of national or international policies, which means that the issue of scaling up is completely missing, simply because Hello? Yeah, we've been cut. Can you hear us? Can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. So I don't know when I've stopped. So this issue of scaling up, I think, which is a crucial one, and I think RCTs are the constraint of the protocol, as we have been saying again and again, are completely unable to respond to this crucial issue of scaling up. Let me take another question regarding, which is a very important question. Okay, we are very critical regarding the limits of RCTs, but what do we offer? I think an alternative position is not to throw out the baby with the water, is that right? But to have a very pragmatic approach, depending on the research question, depending on the context, depending on the prior knowledge that you have in that particular context, then you choose the methods. There is no best methods. It all depends upon the kind of research question that you have. And this alternative approach also draw on a range of methodologies based on interdisciplinarity and analogizing the different ways of producing evidence, both quantitative, and here I think François and Professor Deaton might be in a better position to talk about quasi experiments. I would rather emphasize the added value of qualitative approach, which it seems to me are very much needed in thick descriptions, analytical narratives, ethnography, especially when you are dealing with complicated causality chain, and what qualitative analysis, I think, is very much useful to understand this complexity. And as one of the, someone in the audience was saying that, of course, we also have bad qualitative methods. We also have bad quasi-experiments. Whatever the method, it should always be conducted according to specific rules. And of course, in the field of qualitative analysis, you also have very bad things which are done. And I think the only rule to be followed is design the research protocol according to the kind of research question that you have, and then use all the criteria of rigor, which vary according to the kind of method that you use. I don't think I have much time, so maybe I'm going to leave it here.
Okay, so I may complement and take other questions over Isabelle. So there was questions about, from different point of view, about the advantage and disadvantage of alternative methods, RCT versus quasi-experimental methods. And well, I would say two things. The first one, some points of shortcomings are very specific to RCTs. As it has been said by Professor Deaton, the first one may be ethics. I will just give an example. As they are twisting the whole environment, which observational data are not doing, or much less, they are have implication. And one example, which on microcredit, they give to get an impact and to select the treatment, they give the treatment of microcredit to, in some RCTs in Bosnia, they give the treatment to people who have been rejected by the institution, but who are near the level of being accepted because they didn't fulfill the conditions. And one implication of this is that they put at risk, doing this, they put at risk people having the treatment, the microcredit, of over-indebtedness, for example, to put them in danger. So that's just one example where RCT make a difference in terms of ethical concern with other methods, and there are many others. The second maybe specificity of RCT is linked to statistics versus econometrics. Many of the randomistas are not specialized, even if they get experience with time, in statistical design. They are maybe very good at econometrical procedures, but putting in place a survey, like, for example, the IBGE, National Statistical Office in Brazil requires some very specific skills. So, and that's the second point, we have been able to prove that many of the RCTs surveys, specifically designed by researchers in their labs, are flown. And Florent will come back to this point. But maybe my second point is more general, is that maybe RCT has no specific problems, which is not what I've said previously, but even in this case, the problems come from that randomista, the RCT movement, took the power, and they are claiming that they are the best, the only method in town, the only rigorous method in town. There's all these eviction effects, and so specific to them. And RCTs, among others, why not? And that's our position, but not RCT above all. And I think that's why it's important to raise the point that RCTs are not what they are supposed to be according to the books, at least RCTs in the field, and it should be evaluated with the same standard and have the same size in journals, for example, than other methods. The second point, and linked to this, about the questions, the practice to draw much more than what we've got as results may be a problem encountered by others, but because of this power, the situation of power of randomistas, policymakers, donors will listen to them in priority. If you don't have any RCT, you have nothing. That would be one possible position. And so the implication in terms of real policy may be much problematic with RCT, or at least the implication may be much problematic. And maybe one last question about old question, Hirschman and RCT. I'm not sure I caught the question exactly, but maybe my interpretation is that RCT are just able to address partially, as we quoted previously, local questions, small questions, with the pretension that with aggregation of RCT, we are going to change the world, which we show was not true. And maybe the old way of addressing big issue, macro question, is something which cannot be achieved through RCTs. So that would be my answers to the questions.
Let me just add a few words. The comments are great. Thank you very much, Anna. I enjoyed listening, and the questions on the feed are great too. Let me just pick up a few of them. Something that Isabelle already said. It's a question that I get all the time, and it drives me crazy, which is, what are better methods than RCTs? Well, the methods depend on what you're trying to find out. There's no gold standard. There's no magic method that works in all situations. Method depends on substance. But if you're going to learn understanding, if you're going to find out, you have to be creative and you have to model things. You have to find a way of, trying to model the mechanisms. And not only RCTs, but a lot of quasi experiments too, are attempts to sort of avoid that. Because you've got something that changes and you just look at the outcomes and you don't ask questions why, whether, and so on. So one of the questions about quasi experiments, a lot of the problems with quasi experiments, they're worse than RCTs in some ways. And in fact, a lot of RCTs, the move into RCTs for a lot of economists came because they were so upset about defending quasi experiments in seminars and so on, where people would say, hey, you know, that thing is not really random. It happened for some reason. And they retreated into RCTs, but of course it doesn't really help. I mean, the problem with quasi experiments relative to RCTs is with RCTs, at least you know where the source of the variance is. You made it, right? With a quasi experiment, you usually don't know. And often the papers that use quasi experiments, they often come apart over time when people realize that there's something else going on, like month of birth effects, for instance. People looked at people born in the spring or people born in the fall, and then you got effects of that, but then people discovered that there were lots of other reasons why people were born in the spring or born in the fall. So most natural experiments, you don't really know what's inducing the variance. And so once again, the solution is that you have to begin modeling it. There's one thing in which natural experiments are better. I mean, they don't have the same ethical issues because you're not experimenting on people. You're usually taking advantage of something that's already happened. And again, obviously you can learn things from that. You just have to be sort of cautious about it. So there's no ethical issues, which I think is clearly an advantage of those things. Let me say one thing that you might not expect of me, which is I think one advantage of RCTs, and this came up in one of the questions, or maybe an honest comment, field work. I mean, people actually get out there in the field in order to do RCTs, and they find stuff out, like they find out that their prejudices about the way these people behave are just completely nonsense when they get out there in the countryside and actually start talking to these people who are trying to set up an experiment. So fieldwork's incredibly important because you see things that you were not anticipating and you change your mind about things. And that, I think, is tremendously important. And it's a good thing about the RCT movement. I mean, my friend Bill Easterly on the first book, the Poor Economics that Esther Navajit wrote, always said the thing he liked about it was just that compared with a lot of what development economics had been doing, they were actually out in the countries talking to these people and trying to find out what went on in their lives. That's not to defend the experimental methodology, but it is to defend, you know, and we were doing a lot of armchair development economics before. We were sort of sitting in our offices and assuming people maximized utility and knowing nothing about the institutional structure. And worse than that, claiming that institutional structure didn't matter, which is real terrible nonsense. So I'm all for field research. It was nice to hear Albert Hirschman's name come up. Albert was a friend of mine. I really miss him. He was very nice to me when I first came to Princeton, and he had no good reason to be really nice to me. And I've learned a huge amount, like I imagine everybody has here, from reading Hirschman. But, you know, Hirschman did a lot of field work. He spent a lot of time in Latin America, trying to figure out what was going on there. He also fought, I think, in 3 or 4 different armies during the Second World War. So he had this enormous breadth of experience, and he was a very smart guy, and he thought about it, and he came up with all sorts of generalizations or thoughts which have been useful to us ever since. And again, you don't get those thoughts from doing experiments, or maybe you do when they fail. I mean, so getting on the ground is obviously, you know, a really important thing, and I think we should all do it. Thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you. I think we reached the end of this great panel. I want to thank François, Isabelle, Angus, and Anna for such great presentations and discussion, and the audience for coming and sending your questions. I want to thank all the organizing team and Guilherme Aguiar for technical support and Camila Fonseca for the arts. And stay with us for the next panel on public policy evaluation on microfinance and RCT controversies. See you there. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Obrigado.
Thank you.
Tchau. Thank you. Obrigada. Tchau, tchau.